really just felt like a fog of war type of situation, almost, with flashbangs going off and the pepper spray and the riot shields, and just seeing students getting, beaten with riot shields and clubs and stuff. Yeah, I was pepper sprayed a little bit. Not fun, not an experience I would recommend.
Students from all over the world bravely set up encampments on their campuses to protest the genocide in Palestine. These acts of resistance are showing us how large sections of students are struggling to overcome passivity in the face of imperialist onslaught. What is the Marxist perspective on these encampments? It's easy to see why students are standing up. They don't want to take the genocide sitting down. If your academic institution is complicit in genocide, wouldn't you at least make some noise? We need to see the student movement in the context of the society it's arising from. One with a weak and small communist movement, and a working class with a low level of political consciousness. So of course a student movement arising in this situation is going to deal with many different political contradictions. To understand what exactly went down at these encampments, I talked to students who were on the ground, many of them members of Revolutionary Marxist Students, RMS, a student mass organization operating all over the country, which is in a period of transition given some of the problems highlighted in this video. And what better way to understand the encampments than by starting with the role the university plays in capitalist society?
Yeah, I mean, Colombia is pretty different to like what I'm used to. I went to like a public school in LA, right? Very beat down school, and then sort of going to this very bourgeois institution has been very, very different. I had one individual come up to me, very bourgeois man, tell me about how he really, really wished he could like have a come up story. And like sort of come from like this working class background because of, how it looks and like how people view it, of like, being able to sort of come from nothing, build up.
The university is a site of class struggle. It promotes bourgeois ideology at all levels, how we see society, science, knowledge, but also our purpose in life. The university is a site of controlled dissent. There tends to be a minority of professors allowed who can criticize capitalism and maybe even vaguely discuss revolution. But this is done from a petty bourgeois radical class position. PB radicalism criticizes capitalism from within the system. Another tactic universities employ is by celebrating their radical legacy while defanging it. Colombia is a prime example of this strategy.
Historically, Colombia has been a sort of pretty active political campus. I mean, we talk about the 68 protests, but yeah, I mean, even sort of those protests were largely co-opted. We didn't see much change come from those, very little divestment come from it. And in the end, like sort of Colombia treats it as a fundamental aspect of Colombia. Like when you apply to Colombia, they talk about the political past of Colombia, right? The protests of 68, almost treating it like, oh, we did that, like that was us. When in reality, like they violently repressed them. And now it's interesting because a lot of students are sort of waking up and seeing like they were saying this earlier, but now like they're repressing us, like they're doing it again.
Immediately after brutally cracking down on the protests at Columbia, the university started archiving the banners they took from protesters. No doubt this student encampment will be used in the future to show how radical the university is. The strategy has been successful as many students accept the radical narrative that the university provides on past movements, which is incredibly shallow. It is rare for students to dig deeply into these legacies and analyze the different political lines that produce these movements and ultimately undermine them.
No one really knows about the different splits, the different organizations, the coalitions that were in charge of the Hamilton takeover, of the Columbia takeover. There is sort of a lack of awareness of it, and it's just sort of like this symbol, like the 68 protests. But no one knows what that means.
Even petty bourgeois radicalism is only allowed within certain limits. Calls for divestment, which is far from a revolutionary demand, have been met with swift and severe repression. And why wouldn't they? Zionism is quite profitable.
Penn has this engineering hub, I guess, called Pennovation, and it's in Southwest Philly. And one of the companies that sort of benefits from this is called Ghost Robotics. And they make those four-legged dog robots that I'm not exactly sure their function, but they're used in the police and military. And they give those, or they sell them to the IDF. And so that is one aspect of the camp at Penn, was to expose that tie as just one example and try to get them to shut down Ghost Robotics.
The link gets even more obnoxious for state-funded schools.
UT is a state-funded school, so it's funded by the Texas state, and the highest body of authority at UT, the Board of Regents, is actually appointed by the governor of the state, Greg Abbott. First of all, to even get into the Board of Regents, you have to be a donor. I mean, that's not literally true, but it's effectively true when everyone on the Board of Regents is a donor of Greg Abbott. He's not going to choose anybody that's not on friendly relations with Israel to begin with. And the state of Texas actually is very, very friendly with the state of Israel. Right after October 7th, the state of Texas gave Israel, I think, $150 million over the course of like a couple months. And Greg Abbott himself actually flew down to Israel like a week or two after, maybe. The UT Texas system, there is quite a bit of funding going to Israel through these schools, whether that's through military contractors or currency speculation.
The University of California is the biggest employer in the state. They're the biggest landholder in the state. The UC system is the state of California. And California on its own is the 5th biggest economy in the world. So when we're saying we want the UCs to fully divest from Israel, we're really saying we want the state of California to divest from Israel.
It is clear that universities help research and produce the technology used in military actions by the ruling class, while at the same time reproducing the ideology which justifies the same bourgeois rule. Courses teach us that science is not political. The free market is good, or the free market is bad, but it's all that we have. Or how about the free market doesn't exist, they're just two self-referential post-structural words? Does anything exist? You know, the usual. None of this should be surprising, as the university is one of the many institutions part of the bourgeois state apparatus.
The Marxist understanding of the state, most simply put, is that the state is a tool for class dictatorship or class oppression. As classes began to arise historically, the ruling classes of the various societies, realized we need a tool, an institution in which to ensure our rule. In capitalist society, the ruling class is the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, the police, the military, the jails, even social security, all these various institutions. They use those to ensure their continued rule. The university is an institution that is trying to produce and reproduce knowledge, trying teaching people things we've learned in the past, trying to learn new things, research things. And that institution, like the other institutions in capitalist society, is done at the behest of the bourgeoisie and the capitalist. They are learning things that the capitalists think are important to learn. It's very easy to see when we see these huge funds for defense programs, military contracts, weapons of destruction, weapons that are genociding the Palestinian people now, these huge funds for them. But then, humanities programs, history programs, cultural programs. The university as it exists today is really an institution to reproduce capitalist thinking and capitalist ideology in particular. I'm sure many of us have met people that go through 4 years of university and come out the other side a great citizen, with the correct ideas, quote unquote, about how society is supposed to work and why the system is great. And I'm doing my part because I'm, voting in a ballot. And so it's really an institution to reproduce capitalist ideology.
The university has to employ certain techniques to keep its student body in check. Some class favorites, NGOism, and careerism.
The big thing that kind of everyone is told when you go to college is like, oh, what are you studying to do what? Like, it's very this instrumentalist view of education of like, you are here so you can get a good job, make money when you graduate, support yourself. And it makes sense, like everyone needs to work to reproduce themselves, right? But at Berkeley, there's already this idea of like, these are like the elite students of the state. Like we're the #1 public university and all this kind of squabbling with UCLA for clout and whatever. And there's a real pressure cooker here of people thinking that like they need to be able to get a 6-figure job when they graduate. And that spans across all different types of majors. And the university really like pushes it on people too and makes students compete with each other in a variety of ways when they're already here, whether it be through like the grading systems they use, how hard it is to get into certain majors, classes that weed people out. Like there's already these different ways where it's kind of like you either like pick up your head or you're going to get left behind, and like you need to be better than other people to succeed. And then they have all these career fairs all the time. And, like we've done protests at them a variety of times because 70% of the companies there are direct contractors with the US military. So the careerist stuff, for at least for people who have skills that are very helpful for the war machine, is really pushed of like, you want an easy job after you graduate, go work for the Navy, go work for this lab that does this and that military technology stuff. Then on the other hand, for students who are studying the humanities, there's also this careerist push into NGOism and into like basically just like office bureaucrat jobs, doing professional like DEI work, all these different things that kind of cater to some ideas students have of wanting to do something progressive or something that like helps society, but then they're really just working for like a group that is a bailout for like Bank of America and like is a tax write-off for rich people. Like I don't know if bailout for Bank of America is the right way to phrase it, but it's like a tax write-off for the banks and for wealthy people. And that's really pushed on people too. I mean, no classes here are telling people like join up with the proletariat when you graduate, and it's kind of pushed at students from all sides, their families, the school. Everyone's constantly talking about like research and internship opportunities, and it's also reinforced by the social culture here itself and by other students too. I think for a lot of students, there's this really hard kind of existential push and pull between seeing that society is messed up and wanting to change it, but then also being told by everyone like you just need to like sell out or just like get that good job and like that's how you're going to be happy. And I see so many people around me just feeling really torn up, honestly, over this and not knowing what to do. NGOism is a very effective force at co-optation of student movements and just like progressive movements more generally. I feel like the goal of NGOism is to basically just like bring as many progressive forces under your wing as possible and then stick them in a machine that's just like this like muddled bureaucracy where you can't really do anything to change those things, and then overwork those people, burn those people out until they drop out of working in nonprofits and NGOs and they just go to work somewhere else. And I don't think this is like a conscious conspiracy or something. I think it's just kind of the nature of how bureaucracies like this develop under capitalism. But a lot of students here are very pulled into that idea. And even if it's like grassroots student activism, you can see some of these ideas come into play where, for example, during the encampments, the first thing people sit down and really try to struggle about most of the time is not like, what's our political line of what we're trying to do? Like, what are the lines of demarcation? Like, what are our points of unity? Like, beyond just the kind of most surface level calls for divestment, for BDS, like, how do we actually make change on this campus? A lot of times it's like, how do we coordinate all of our food? How do we coordinate our donations?
All ideas are branded with the stamp of a class, and the kind of dissent which the university is promoting is ultimately that of petty bourgeois radicalism, criticizing the system from within the system.
A petty bourgeois radical is something that we've seen throughout history when it comes to calls for revolution or change or wanting something different. And they are different from liberals in the sense that they would articulate different things. They might critique capitalism, or they might have critiques of imperialism, or these systems, and they have a clear vision of things that are bad, right? Unfortunately, a lot of them don't take what's really necessary, I think, which is a scientific approach to these questions. And instead, they end up taking a little bit more eclectic understanding of what is actually happening at this university. Why is the state of Texas so invested in Israel? Why is the university system so tied up with the state of Israel? Those questions end up getting kind of foggy for the petty bourgeois radicals because they're not taking a scientific approach or a class analysis to the approach of the university. The petty bourgeois radical's orientation to the state typically is fairly eclectic. It can go anywhere from the state as it exists today, the Texas state or the US government is fascist, and we're living under a fascist government. And that means, we have to do everything in our power to make sure fascism is slowly less encroaching, or we have to, align with maybe the Democrats and fight against the Republicans, who are these fascist forebringers. And it could also even go as far as, maybe there's just some bad people in the government, and the government itself is actually good, and certain aspects of the government need to be worked within. That's kind of some of the difficulty with the petty bourgeois radicalism, is that this eclecticism, this kind of variance in kind of what we think, swings back and forth so often. At one point, the US government is a fascist state, and at another point we need to vote for Democrats because they're going to stop the US government from being fascist. Unfortunately, they're not always super consistent. The same thing is applied to revolution. Some petty bourgeois radicals, think the Palestine protests themselves were the revolution coming about. The encampment is the revolution, and it's starting now, and it's the vanguard of a larger spontaneous uprising. Other petty bourgeois radicals would say revolution isn't possible in the United States, and we have to find ways to work within the system. And these Palestinian protests are the, beginning of that reform movement. Some of these positions might seem contradictory to each other, but, they're really not in the minds of a petty bourgeois radical. They kind of vacillate between them very easily, very fluidly in a way.
It should be unsurprising that without a strong communist movement, which requires a fusion of communists and the working class movement, a proletarian outlook does not dominate on campus.
Ultimately, the impression I got from talking to people is that people care very deeply about the issue, and they're honestly heartbroken about what's going on, and rightfully so. And when I asked people how they learned about this issue, a lot of them actually learned about it from Instagram and seeing videos on Instagram. And people were telling me, I saw those fucked up pictures and videos and read horrible things about what's going on in Palestine. It really upset me. And so that's kind of how they got compelled to show up to the camp, but I don't think they've studied much about it. And honestly, they're very brave. They're willing to sleep in the cold and rain in these tents without proper accommodations. They're willing to stand up to the police, to their peers, face academic consequences. And they know that it's going to be uncomfortable, or it could result in grave harm to themselves, but they're willing to do it anyway.
A lot of the things that we see students, get riled up about is typically, something that's going on in this country, as they should, as there's much going on in this country that deserves to get riled up about. But it was even more exciting to see students care about something going across, the world. In particular, this genocide is in particular very, very difficult to watch. We're getting constant news updates about it. If you care about anything going on in the world, you're going to see constant images. And so I think it is positive that students are willing to go out and do something for that, and mobilize themselves in an effort to try and change, even if there's a bunch of mistakes and missteps and confusions about it. I think fundamentally we have to see what's positive here, and say it's good when students come out. It's good when people go out and they want to see change. And so I think that's just an overwhelming positive in particular.
I'm also a labor organizer that works to organize graduate students with Underpaid at UT. I've seen a lot of graduate students become mobilized, people who were not necessarily motivated to fight over economic issues, become motivated to fight over these kind of broader political issues, right? I had a friend who hadn't been involved with Underpaid for years tell me, I wish I knew Underpaid could do this. I would have got involved. And now he's sending out petitions to his department and getting organized and much more interested in what I have to say about kind of the communist perspective on Palestine, and talking about, groups like the PFLP and the, deep historical roots that the Marxists have in the Palestinian struggle, right? And so that's been a very positive development. I think I'm hoping to be able to talk to some, or do a teach-in with some of the graduate students at UT about the 1969 PFLP strategy statement. I think that's one of the strongest articulations of the path to Palestinian liberation to date. And I think the more that students and workers can have exposure to those ideas, the better.
A low level of working class political consciousness, no communist party leading the struggle of the proletariat. We can't expect perfect politics from the student encampments. The bottom line is that students are horrified and disgusted by watching a genocide unfold on their phones. They're putting the bodies on the line to do something. For many, this involves taking part in a series of life-changing events. Many Palestinians have expressed solidarity with students risking their careers and health to show they refuse to be complicit in a genocide. The genocide in Palestine is facilitated by the capitalist imperialist system. For those of us who recognize the necessity of revolution to abolish the system, we need to do two things. We need to unite with the positives of this movement in the US while criticizing bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideas that arise in any protest movement.
I'm worried that the school is just going to kind of try to let the encampment eat itself and let student infighting and lack of political unity kind of just slowly erode what's going on, which is what they did at People's Park when we had an occupation there. And seems to be the strategy of the UCs, as they figured. Not all the UCs of UC Berkeley, let me be specific.
It can be tempting to leave it at that and to celebrate our wins. But if you're like me, and you're tired of seeing every genuine-hearted movement get co-opted by the bourgeoisie, we have to also dissect some of the bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideas which inevitably circulate on campuses. And we have to do so from the spirit of unity, struggle, unity. Which means we start from a place of unity and only struggle to reach a higher level of unity. And we have to interrogate why a university could even just take the route of watching something fizzle out and eat itself up. A good way to analyze a movement is by looking at its demands.
They had the same 3 demands as a lot of universities did. I know there's some variation, but it was disclose endowment, divest from anything related to the IDF or Israel at large, and then protect student protesters or people that are advocating for Palestine.
After divestment is where some of the demands start getting a little bit more varied. Some want to call for Jay Hartzell, who is the president of UT, to step down. Other ones want, there was briefly a call for like a people's university, like have the university come back and be a part of the community. What that actually means is kind of vague depending on who you ask. And a variety of other calls. One of them that's also fairly consistent is that, get the National Guard out of here, get the police out of here. People have the right to protest. In a certain way, that was honestly probably the widest, kind of the widest demand of any student or anybody really, even people that aren't really maybe pro-Palestine even or Palestinian solidarity. They would be like, I don't really have a stance, but those kids have the right to do what they want to do, which was very, very common around here. It's like, I'm not sure how I feel about Palestine, but those kids can do what they want. They're not hurting anybody. Why are you bringing those, state out troopers out there? The divestment and, just exercising your right to protest were pretty common throughout the whole thing.
Full divestment is going to happen without a much larger struggle. And even just how can you really divest from Israel when imperialism still exists? That's also kind of a question that I think needs to be reckoned with a little bit, because the webs of capitalist imperialism are so interwoven. We can't just metaphysically chop off these chunks and say, okay, we've separated ourselves from the imperialist system. And even just cutting off Israel, if they find a way to do that, are we going to stop providing resources to every other capitalist country? What about the way that the UC upholds oppression at home and oppresses their own workers, oppresses the people? It just brings up a lot of other questions where really these reforms are a step and a progressive call. But when you get into the nitty gritty of is this actually enough to stop the root cause of this? It isn't. And I think that's something that students struggle to accept because it can be daunting or overwhelming. But I think it does just give a sense of the urgency of the task and the gravity of what we're trying to accomplish, and also how we can be direct with people about these reforms and be very frank about what they can and what they can't do.
The orientation for a people's university, which I think actually has a really good origin, which is this idea that we should decide, what we're learning. We have the right to, as a community, decide what we want on our syllabus, decide, how we're running our university, what we're financing, what we're putting our money into, which I think are all progressive and good calls. I think, unfortunately, the People's University calls ended up being slightly vague in terms of what they were really trying to prescribe. When we think about a people's university as Marxist, right? We're going to apply a class analysis to the university. And we're going to make very clear that a people's university would be a university run by the working class and in service of the working class. Unfortunately, a lot of the people articulating a people's university type idea would either be liberals or kind of petty bourgeois radicals who aren't taking a class analysis to that approach. And so the type of articulations you get from that end up being very varied. I think one thing that is sticking with a lot of people, though, from those initial calls is the idea that, we have the right to control what we want to learn. We have the right to control this state-sponsored institution. I think a lot of people really resonate with that, even if they don't have a very clear idea of what that would look like or what that would exactly mean.
Being a student is a weird thing because it's not a class. Like a student isn't your relationship to capitalist production. It's your relationship to education, to kind of what you're doing with most of your time. But it's kind of this very temporary thing. It's almost like a hat you put on for a few years and then most people take it off and then, become either a worker or they become kind of a member of the petty bourgeoisie, or some students become, members of the actual bourgeoisie, whether it be small, kind of lower level bourgeoisie, and then the very few become the big bourgeoisie, right? But so students are a very mixed class force, or the working class, it's a clear group of people with a clear relationship to production. It's a pretty stable thing that has existed for a very long time. People aren't really working class for just 4 years and then leave and just become another class, So I think when we're talking about fusing these two movements together, it's really about how do we bring kind of the class interests of the working class and fuse them with some of the, kind of forward-thinking aspects of the student movement, which is that students are a lot of times more in this phase of the struggle in the United States are more exposed to Marxism in certain ways. There is some interest to engage with study and theory and learning, even though a lot of it is really colored by the university. There's a lot of very popular classes at Cal about racial capitalism, which is, kind of a confused way of phrasing it, but topics like that are very big in classes here. Students are eager to take up struggle on things like Palestine in a way that right now the working class has not been at the same level due to the real atrophy of the communist movement in the United States and the weakening of the trade union struggle at all in the United States. Where students, there's kind of these constant kind of petty bourgeois radical upswings every once in a while. But because there isn't this working class perspective, they kind of peter out because they don't have a broader view or aim of the abolition of all classes, of the liberation of the proletariat. So I think by bringing both movements together, we can talk really broad scale about what each can contribute, but also at a more practical level. For example, there's been some pretty exciting stuff in the Bay Area with this coalition called Labor for Palestine that some of the comrades and Teamsters Mobilize have been involved with. And there has been some real steps taken forward by progressives in the unions to agitate around Palestine, to bring internationalism to the working class. But the average student at UC Berkeley has been very removed from all of this. And one kind of exciting thing that is bridging these two groups together a little bit is this kind of surge of graduate students into traditionally more industrial unions, because unions like the UAW because of like the decreasing of certain manufacturing in the United States, have tried to pad their membership with the UCs and with grad students. And they've actually been the leading force in the UAW, really pushing Sean Fain and other leadership to take more progressive stances on Palestine. And that has had ripple effects. So that's kind of one interesting way, like students and workers, grad students, as being in kind of this middle position, I think have been playing an interesting role in politicizing other members of their unions. But yeah, largely these things exist very separately from each other, where we've seen, other movements historically where there has been more of a fusion, even in small ways. A lot more can happen when we're bringing these forces together. Like when students are, protesting in the 60s and 70s against the Vietnam War, and you have, either active duty members of the US military who are also like actively dissenting and refusing orders and rebelling, or you have workers who are launching like strikes and political strikes about the war and refusing to engage in production in certain ways. For example, the ILWU in the Bay Area has been a pretty consistent radical and militant union for like over 100 years, and they frequently will like shut down the ports in protest of certain things going on. But that's a pretty still small part of it. But I've been talking about it with students a lot on campus of imagine when these occupations started, and even just when the war began in Gaza in the first place, and when it became clear quite soon that it was a genocide. Imagine if we had workers organized enough where we had a general strike across the United States where workers were like, fuck this, we're not producing shit for the war in Israel, we're not supporting this. Like, that is what puts sand in the gears. That's what actually makes it so that the imperialists can't achieve their aims. And students, we can still do a lot. We can still raise a lot of attention to something. We can try to go out and politicize non-students and working class forces, but we can't actually stop production. We can't shut down the capitalist system. So I think that's something that's really been on people's minds of how do we actually stop things like the genocide in Palestine from happening? It can't happen without an overthrow of the imperialists, and students can't be doing that alone. So I think that's something we've been really trying to talk about with folks on campus at RMS, of really understanding like the role that the liberation of the proletariat plays in the liberation of humanity. Because I think people still do have some ideas that if students just get it together enough, that's enough to change society. And if we just have enough students protest, we'll be able to get something as powerful as the entire University of California system to divest from Israel.
From the Marxist perspective, we know the masses make history. It's the people that make history, right? And it's the students and it's the working class getting out there and getting in the streets and, putting their demands forward that really does make history. At the same time, there is a responsibility of those of us who have taken the time to try and understand society on a scientific level, on the level of class, and trying to understand it as clearly as possible. If we take the time and we learn, just like I said, that the state is a product of class society that is in service of the bourgeoisie. That is a scientific analysis. And it takes a while to learn that. You don't just learn that from going outside in a protest, right? You can learn a lot of things in a protest, like the police aren't my friends, but that's not going to give you a scientific understanding of society, right? You have to study, you have to read some books, and much to the chagrin of maybe some students who are really energized and want to do some action that I totally understand. There's going to be a lot of scientific understanding that is necessary if we want to see these movements advance in their demands, advance in their tactics and strategy, and actually begin to win, some demands of these students. So when I say, it's our job as Marxists, I'm speaking of something that's been consistent through Marxist history for a very, very long time. Something as these movements began coming down, and it's something I read earlier this year, and I decided to come back to it because it was very helpful for me, but it's Lenin's The Student Movement in the Present Political Situation. situation. And in that, there's some students, social democratic students in early Russia in 1908, and they're saying, oh, there's an academic student strike that's going on. And they're saying this student strike is so narrow. It's not talking about revolution. It's not talking about overthrowing the czar. And as a result, we're not going to engage with it. We're not going to do anything about it. It's negative. We're not about it. Lenin takes a moment to say, no, that's wrong. And he takes a moment to correct it. And he's saying, you're right. This student movement is narrow. The student movement does have problems. The student movement isn't talking about revolution. And that's because we haven't done enough to articulate why that's necessary. And this is the moment when we articulate that. They care. They want something to be different. They want something to change. And that's when we start telling them, we know how things can change. We know society at a very deep level. We've studied it scientifically. And so that's what I mean when I'm talking about our job as Marxists. We have to take the time to articulate that to students. You know, I didn't become a Marxist overnight. It took a lot of people articulating a lot of things to me, and it took a lot of books and a lot of really furrowing my brow to really get that. And we have to give that same patience to the students, I think, as well. If there's one thing I could say to students, if they were to listen to me at all, it would be, great, I'm so glad you went out there and did these. Now you need to go hit the books. And, you know, it seems kind of silly, but it's absolutely true. If you want to understand society, if you want to change society, you have to understand it, and you have to understand it at a very deep level. And so, you know, anybody who takes these politics seriously, anybody out in those encampments that really want to see change, hit the books, learn about Marxism, learn about, you know, the development of revolutionary history, and learn about the science of dialectical materialism.
Watching a genocide unfold is enough to make your blood curdle. And to imagine being in Palestine right now is absolutely horrific. We could say the same thing about Sudan. And all the other ways capitalism, imperialism is making life an absolute nightmare for the majority of people on this planet. We could then do two things. We could shield ourselves and focus on self-preservation, or give everything we can to create a world in which genocides are shadows of a distant past. Is revolution a science? If not, then there's nothing we can do but hope for a magic bullet. But if it is, then why not study it? Why not give everything we can to make revolution a reality? Student movements are going to continue to be divided and politically weak without a communist party and a strong working class movement, without communists pushing to fuse the communist and working class movement. RMS is a mass organization of MCU, a pre-party formation. And MCU has seen that while it is extremely important to continue to organize students, the key task currently is broader, to struggle and win over semi-Marxists to build up a communist party. For this reason, RMS is developing into a general educational wing of MCU to win over all sections of society, including students, to Maoism. While RMS is in a period of transition, it is still running a summer study about the Chinese Revolution you can get connected to. Find information about revolutionary Marxist students and the pre-party formation it's connected to, MCU, in the description. In Struggle for a Better Future, Law Salam. Thank you for watching.